Good evening. Thank you all for coming at short notice. My name is Dean Godson. I'm Director of Policy Exchange. It's my pleasure to be able to welcome you all tonight for this first event in our series, which inaugurates our new prosperity programme. There'll be 3 book launches. This is the first of them. We're delighted that Jesse Norman, whom I joined Policy Exchange with on the same day, so we're sort of graduates of the same class back in 2005, Andrew Bailey, whom I haven't seen very much of since our university days together when my hair was on my head rather than on my face. So Andrew was just about able to recognise me, but it's a great privilege to be able to, second of Jesse's books that we've had the pleasure of launching, first on Edmund Burke, part of his own series as one of the most important conservative parliamentary thinkers of our time. We're glad that colleagues and others are here. The usual policy exchange, house rules obtain, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. So looking forward to a proper, if not a dust-up between our 2 protagonists, at least a thoroughgoing intellectual exchange of the kind which we expect from them both. Please join me in expressing our pleasure in their presence and look forward to your own participation in tonight's event as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dean, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along today. We thought the format, the preferred format might be for me to say a few words just of sufficient idiocy or provocative power to get you all going, and then Andrew and I talk for a bit, and then perhaps we'd open it up and you can hit us with whatever you've got. By the way, I hope at least as much to the head of the FCA as to the author of this book. And now I will be skinned alive by Marek, our magnificent bookseller, if I don't say at once that there is a book for sale at the back of this hall, and actually no one can buy this book before you can, ladies and gentlemen, if you buy it today, and I would be delighted to sign a copy at the end, if that would please you as well. So thank you very much indeed. Let me just set the scene a little bit, if I may, for you, and may I say that it's testimony to my chair, to Dean, and to the pulling power of Policy Exchange that somewhere between Adam Smith and the alcohol that is being made available freely tonight and the absence of World Cup game, one email has been enough to secure this astonishingly high quality and prestigious crowd. And I'm very, very excited that that is the case. We're here, at least I'm here, to celebrate this fella, Adam Smith, a man who is as widely traduced as he is celebrated, undoubtedly the most influential economist who ever lived, and I think, without much doubt, one of the most influential social scientists of any kind. And if you read the book, I'm not going to try to summarize such a cornucopia of intellectual riches, but you will discover that amongst other things, Smith isn't just the greatest political economist of all time and the father of economics, he is also the father of social psychology. And I think that gives a completely different way of thinking about Smith, because it forces us to deal with these 2 great works, not individually, The Wealth of Nations on one side and The Theory of Moral Sentiments on the other side, and of course the unpublished samizdat notes that make up the lectures on jurisprudence in the middle and the early essay on astronomy and the stuff on language. We can't just take those things individually, we have to pull them together into one coherent account of what Smith is saying. So let's just anchor him a little bit for those who aren't necessarily quite au fait with the history. Born in 1723 and dies in 1720. Born in Kirkcaldy, a port that had been flourishing but was starting to fall on hard times as the axis of power in Scottish trade moves from the east and the Baltic towards the west and the tobacco routes out towards the Americas. And then Smith grows up, goes to Glasgow University, and then goes to Balliol College, Oxford, which he cordially despises. Interestingly, he attributes the excellence of the Scottish educational system at the time, which was, of course, 5 universities, as opposed to the 2.5 in England, Oxford, Cambridge, and the Inns of Court. He attributes the excellence of the Scottish university system to the fact that in Scotland, unlike in England, the students actually pay for the lecturers. So I think it's appropriate to credit to Balliol College, Oxford, where this contrast becomes manifest to him, the role of the true home of student fees. Ladies and gentlemen, which anyone who knows that college will understand the perfect poignancy of that identification. So he goes to Balliol, he comes out of Balliol, and then comes home, and nothing much happens for a few years, and then he gives a series of lectures, goes back to Glasgow as a professor, switches professorship, stays at Glasgow, goes on a great tour for 3 years with 2.5 years with the Duke of Buccleuch, his patron, and then comes back and stays in Scotland for the rest of his life, or in England from time to time as well. The Theory of Moral Sentiments dated 1759, The Wealth of Nations dated 1776, a great year, as you may recall, for literature, if not for colonial relations, since Gibbon's Decline and Fall is also published, the first volume in that year, and then lives in great splendour and intellectual splendour, not personal splendour, in the Canongate in Edinburgh until 1790, and leaves a legacy that is not much celebrated except by a few cognoscenti at the time, but then becomes one of everlasting glory as people start to absorb what he says. So let me just focus on a couple of things about Smith, and in particular the Smithian idea of economics and the Smithian idea of trade, and then talk a little bit about crony capitalism, i.e. default ways in which the system that Smith is talking about can go wrong, and then I'm going to sit down and we'll start a wider conversation. So there is a view of Smith which is, there are two views of Smith which we can contrast, I think, actually. One is that Smith is the market fundamentalist par excellence, somehow an apologist for human inequality, a great advocate of selfishness, and the selfishness embedded in the market system as he's supposed to see it in The Wealth of Nations. And the other is that he's the great libertarian, a laissez-faire thinker who celebrates the abolition of interventions into markets and seeks a minimalist or ultimately vestigial state. Neither of these two views is remotely correct. And if you believe either of those two views, then I can say with absolute certainty that nothing you think about Smith is true. Smith is a vastly more subtle and interesting figure than that. And for him, markets are not merely the economic atomistic entities of our current theoretical economic models. They are institutions, they are living, breathing entities. We're full of people who have preferences which change over time and change in reaction to each other. They are dynamic, they are continuously evolving, and they don't just evolve in themselves, but they also evolve in relation to the state. So he has a theory of how the state, a political theory about how the state evolves over time, notably in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, in which what is seen as the progressive elaboration of property in the form of government was always developed together, he says, develop, as it were, pari passu. And the result is an evolving conception of political economy that anticipates and in some respects forms the template for the Darwinian idea of evolution. And Darwin himself was a great student of Smith, and it's no surprise that the Darwinian theory, when it does start to get revealed in all its glory, has some very Smithian elements. So that is the conception of markets that we're seeing there. It's not surprising in the nest of interventions in markets that existed in the 18th century, in which they were very much the creature not merely of state decisions about customs and excise and the Navigation Acts and the like, but also of clerical and church interventions or guild interventions. It's not surprising that a liberalising message, that is to say, what he calls the system of natural liberty, the removal of impediments to trade, should act to create not merely wealth but also greater equality. After all, the whole point about markets as an era is that they are characteristic of the commercial what he calls commercial society. And commercial society is the replacement, is the successor to feudalism. In feudalism, a person is subordinate personally to another, but in market society, Smith says, every man is in himself a merchant and lives by exchanging, and that is to say, lives in a context of presumed equality, and one where there may be dependence, but it's economic dependence rather than personal subordination. So, of course, in that context, a liberalizing message can be both equalizing and also socially enriching. But what is so interesting is, therefore, to reflect now in an era of the 20th century and 21st century on what the relationship between states and markets might be. And as we can discuss in the Q&A, Smith's theory of the state is vastly more sophisticated, both in terms of its functions and in terms of the things he's prepared to contemplate as state interventions than we give him credit for. Let me now say this. So that is what markets are in broad outline. But markets, of course, and we're talking 50 or 60 years before the development of capitalism, capitalism in its modern sense, and don't take my word for it, you can look at Angus Madison or other great theorists of the longue durée in economics. Capitalism isn't really get going until the 1840s, when you start to see corporations as autonomous pools of capital working alongside and sometimes through and often against markets. That's that combination of markets and corporate power that constitutes, as it were, modern industrial capitalism. And that's before, that really is, we're operating 50 or so years before that with Smith, and in fact more like 65 or 70 years when you get to The Wealth of Nations. So Smith is not a theorist of capitalism, he is a theorist of markets. But astonishingly, he has a theory of what happens when markets and pools of capital go wrong. He has what you might call a theory of crony capitalism. That focuses on three things. And I think it'd be very interesting just to spell those out, not just because I think they're interesting themselves, but also because I want to ask Andrew some questions about how he thinks crony capitalism is being fought by the FCA at the moment in the financial markets. So there are three things. The first is rent extraction. Okay, now rent extraction, very broadly speaking, is the charging of a non-market price, and you can have good rents in the form of the goodwill and the prestige that occurs when you're associated with branding, but you can have bad rents which occur when companies seek preferred positions, often by manipulating legislators. So that's one thing, rent extraction. And the second is what you might call informational and power asymmetries between insiders and outsiders. Fascinatingly, Smith says that whenever there's a conflict between the masters, that is, people who control labour, and the workers, the interests of the workers should always be preferred in legislation, because the playing field is so naturally unfair between the two, because the asymmetries of power between the two are so great. And I invite you to think about what asymmetries of information and power we might be thinking of these days, especially in relation to things like technology platforms. And then the final one is what's known in economics as the principal agent problem, which is, broadly speaking, we pay them and then they don't do what we want. And shareholders with managers who essentially succumb to their own agendas and do not discharge the function for which they have been put into place and may, in some sense, go native or the like. So those three things are characteristic of Smith's analysis of what I take to be crony capitalism, just as strongly in the 1770s and 80s in relation to the East India Company and the mercantile system and the great colonial empires that were building up at the time, but just as strongly then as now. Those three ideas, rent extraction, informational and power asymmetries, and a principal agent problem. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, let me shut up. Let me end by repeating, in deference to Marek, that this book is available to be sold at the end of the evening, and I hope you'll load up on it and buy some early Christmas presents for all your friends. Thank you very much indeed.
So, how are we going to do this?
However you want. You can ask a few questions, I'll ask you a few questions.
Let me offer a few thoughts as well. I've had the advantage of reading the book as well, so I got an advanced copy, which was and it's let me say, without any sense of bias, it is a fascinating book. I mean, in a sense, when you said you were going to write a book on Adam Smith, the first thing is another book on Adam Smith, but I can tell you that I'm not making that noise. It's it's actually well worth a read for reasons that Jesse gave. And actually, for me, it actually joins up two of the things that I've done. Firstly, what I've done for the last 30 odd years, which is public policy, and particularly in the world of central banking and regulation. Before that, actually, I did a PhD in economic history and taught economic history. So I have a period just after Smith. So it appeals to me in more than one sense. And I think you're right to highlight, Jesse, I think a few things that I'd pick out about Smith. I mean, firstly, some of the misconceptions of Smith that have been created. And I think you make an interesting point in the book, which I think is true, is that Smith comes from an era when economics was, I think you used nearly this phrase, and I do, descriptive rather than prescriptive. I think prescriptive economics actually really probably postdates certainly the 1815 Corn Laws, passage of the 1815 Corn Law, and what eventually becomes quite topical today, given the comments that were made earlier today, the campaign for the repeal of the Corn Laws. And I think economics at that point becomes more prescriptive. But in Smith's era, it was essentially descriptive, and far more. And The Wealth of Nations is essentially far more of a descriptive book. And I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it has probably lent itself to people interpreting Smith in different ways, because in a sense it's there to be interpreted. Secondly, I think it's led to a whole industry of trying to, in a sense, tie together Smith's, as you said, Smith's two large books, large contributions, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, and people puzzling over this. And one of the things that I found fascinating about the book was that you actually do this, I think, in a way that I'm not sure has been done before, because I'm not familiar with all the books written on Smith, which is to draw on the lectures on jurisprudence, which many people, I mean, it's often said he would have written a third book had he, at the time, which was on jurisprudence. He left the lectures, as Jesse said, there is some other material he left, but in fact he ordered most of his papers to be burnt at the point of his death.
18 thin. What does he say? 18 thin portfolio.
18 thin. A few things survived, including the lectures on jurisprudence, or was it a transcript of the lectures on jurisprudence?
Students' notes.
Students' notes.
Two
right.
separate sets of student notes.
And as you say, this really ties it together because, in a sense, if you interpret The Wealth of Nations wrongly, as Jesse says, as what it isn't, but as a sort of a panacea or sort of an advocacy of unadulterated free markets, and then you try to sort of link that to The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a book about morality. You sort of puzzle about how to tie these two together. It isn't difficult, as Jesse says, and this is what we'll come on to. Theory of jurisprudence helps because, as you say in the book, that's how he sort of brings the state in. And it's easier to bring the state in the sense of the state's role in the legal system, and particularly in the legal system of the 18th century, and what you, I think, rightly describe as pre-industrial commercial society. I would argue, and if I was to sort of challenge you a bit on it, I think he is more pre-industrial than you perhaps occasionally in the book give him credit for, in the sense that in setting out and describing the division of labour, the thing that we put on the back of the £20 note with Adam Smith on the pin factory, he sets out, as you say rightly in the book, how exchange takes place in the economy, how productivity therefore increases through the labour value of exchange, how trade happens and how consumption happens. And that's a description in the sense of a system which was changed in the 18th century. The increase in productivity in the 18th century, in a sense, is the precursor that allows industrialisation to happen. But as you say, he's pre-capitalist, no doubt about that. But what he does, and I think this is the sort of the pulling together of the whole thing, is that as well as, in a sense, a sort of a describing of a commercial society, he clearly founds that commercial society on morals, on moral values, on ethics, if you like, and on a role for government and the state. And this is what you challenged about linking Smith to today, and I think what would be very good to talk about, because in Smith, it seems to me, there is a very strong articulation of the public interest. He sets it out quite clearly. I think you produced this quote from The Wealth of Nations. It's also, I think, a quote that Deirdre McCloskey has used in setting out that evolution of commercial society, in saying there will be times when private and public interests clash, and they have to be managed. And Smith, it seems to me, founds, therefore, that view that private interests have to, in a sense, operate within the public interest, within moral values in society, and that's how you tie his two great works together.
Yes, well, that's very, very interesting. Let me just make a couple of comments on that. So, the first comment I would make is, of course, when you see things, can everyone hear okay? With this, great. When you see things not in terms of capitalism, but in terms of commercial society, actually, I think you get a completely different feel for it in a way that's quite interesting. So, it's hard to think of capitalism as anything other than an economic, as it were, system or set of circumstances. Whereas commercial society pushes you where he wants you to go, which is to thinking about property and property-based market relations as intrinsically the stuff of human society as mediated through the state. And so you are having, when property rights change, which they do through the elaboration of the common law and through statutes, you're automatically in a world of political economy. And so it therefore becomes a mistake in the 19th century, I mean, for perfectly understandable reasons, to isolate the economy as an entity, independent of politics, and to analyze it independently of, as it were, other considerations. And you get lots of benefits from it because you're making simplifying assumptions which allow you to model certain outcomes, and that's where all the benefits of good economics comes. But you're actually doing violence to the nature of what's really going on. What really matters is commercial society rather than capitalism. So it's a social thing. Then the second thing that comes out of that is commercial society for Smith has a built-in legitimacy to it because it's a society. It's intended, and it's by design, to the extent it has any design, by evolved, as it were, purpose, it benefits everyone. That is the test of the legitimacy of commercial society. Capitalism doesn't have a test associated with its legitimacy. It just exists in some sense. So by anchoring it in society, by anchoring market transactions in society, we automatically realize what's gone wrong when some people are left out of doing well economically or persistently fail to be helped by the commercial society of which they're part. I think that's quite a helpful 20th century development. And ultimately, it's going to be the state, alongside individual economic actors, which is responsible for maintaining the legitimacy of the whole thing. And I think that, again, is quite an important reorientation. The second thing is, I think you're right to describe The Wealth of Nations as descriptive in the first 2 or 3 books. By the time you get to the end of The Wealth of Nations, a lot of its purpose as a policy tract has started to come out, and it isn't really surprising that Smith refers to it. There's a famous moment you may recall when David Hume dies and Smith writes a beautiful letter to Strahan, which is basically an elegy for Hume. And I might read a bit of it later on if you don't know. It is absolutely marvellous. And of course it is instantly regarded as a thoroughly provocative attack on established religion in praise of a dreadful atheist. And the roof comes in, falls in, and Smith is massively denounced by these great establishment figures. And he says in a letter, he said, I had no idea that a few harmless sheets I'd written on the death of Mr. Hume would bring me more trouble than my very violent attack on the entire commercial society system of Great Britain, mercantile system of Great Britain. And so it is an attack, and there is a big, punchy, as it were, prescriptive message sitting in there. And what is interesting, if you go back, and others have looked at this much more than I can do in the book, but the 18th century is absolutely a time when people have noticed that decisions you make in Parliament can affect economic well-being. And you get an enormous array. There are probably 5,000 acts of Parliament in the first 3 quarters of the 18th century of an economic nature, trying to make change. And often it's, build this bridge, or don't build this bridge, or, enfranchise these rights. A lot of it's about, as it were, individual people petitioning the Parliament to do things for them. But that, plus an understanding of the way in which numbers are starting to become definitional of economic activity, means the 18th century really does start to be much more recognisable in our terms as a place where commercial exchange takes place, but also policy exchange takes place. And what a better place could we have to celebrate policy exchange than this room? So those are my 2 comments on what you said.
I think the interesting thing for me, bringing it up to the sort of experience of recent years, is I think Smith had this sort of view on morality and public interest with Smith. Although he set out, as I said, and you say, a view on the role of the state, I think that for Smith, this question about how the public interest and, how, as you say, respect for property rights is enshrined. It is an expectation that it was, in a sense, present in all members of society. There's an obligation, if you like, that runs through society. The reason I think that's relevant to today, and to the, as you draw on in the book, Jesse, the financial crisis, is that I think we arrived at a period, in the sort of, if you like, at the sort of the outbreak of the financial crisis, where, if you like, almost norms in society, and particularly in finance, had moved towards over a period, I think, of at least probably 20 or 30 years. I'm happy to come on to explain why I think that in a moment. An expectation that there was a far more if you're in the private sector, you let it rip sort of thing, and there's a role for the state and regulators, but it's much diminished, and this is the so-called light touch regulation era, and that's quite different. And Adam Smith is, in a sense, is prayed in aid, and that's actually, I think, quite different from what Smith himself actually sets out.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right, and of course Smith has a theory of norms. If I can just be a little bit technical for a second, and in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, a book of social psychology, and that theory is all about how do we come to agree certain things about moral or social behaviour amongst ourselves. And the way he thinks we do it is that, very broadly speaking, we seek to be, not merely to be loved, but to be lovely, that is, to be worthy of love or esteem by others. And so we try to do things that we think will earn others' esteem, and it's a form of competitive behaviour in a way in its own right. And that, for Smith, creates this great ambivalence between the socially and sometimes economically enriching effects of that competitiveness and the spirit of materialism which animates it, which he really despises. And so there's this extraordinary kind of interplay between those two things. And he thinks that there's something rather debased about the human instinct to admire the rich and the powerful. And to enjoy and to spend all one's money on what he calls trinkets of frivolous utility, a phrase he greatly enjoys and uses a couple of times. More often, it should be said, than the words invisible hand in The Wealth of Nations, which he uses just once. If next time someone says that Smith's got a theory of the invisible hand, you tell them he's got a theory of trinkets of what does he say, something utility, you'll be more accurate. So there was a normative understanding of what was expected inside a market was something that went alongside the market because it mediated what transactions were made, what trust existed inside it, how it was viewed by others, and how it was viewed by the state. And the state might cut a market some slack from a belief that it was a fundamentally law-abiding and honourable thing. Now, if that ever existed in the City of London in the pre-1980s, it certainly didn't exist after that, because it turned out that new norms emerged, which, broadly speaking, became fill your boots. And let me just give you a classic moment in human history when we can date this, which is the moment where the partners of Goldman Sachs decide they're going to go public. And that's a crucial moment, because that moment is the moment where Goldman Partners decided that the accrued goodwill in the partnership of 150 years was going to be capitalized and trousered by that generation, okay? And of course, they didn't want to do it. They were worried about they thought it was embarrassing because they would be essentially taking money as it was, which other partners, 150.
The revenge of Goldman Sachs.
Exactly. Goldman's blocking technologies being used. No. So for 150 years, partners had not helped themselves to the loot, and this generation did. So they had to tell themselves a story. What was the ratifying story? Well, we're never going to. The ratifying story was we live in a cutthroat world, ladies and gentlemen, and this bank cannot survive if it doesn't have access to more capital. And a private institution with goodness knows how many $1 billion of capital that we have, and goodness knows how much capacity we have to borrow in the markets, on top of that, is inadequate. We need to become a full-throated public institution. And of course, the effect of that was that those partners who happened to be sitting on the chair when the music ended made of the order of $100 million apiece. Now, that, to me, was a very important moment. And if you had talked to the previous generation of Goldman partners, one of whom I knew very well, John Whitehead, who'd been chief executive of Goldman in the 1980s, they would have been spinning, and they were spinning in Nottingham in their graves or in their seats. And I think that just makes the point you make very nicely.
Well, just to develop that a bit, a year or so ago, I did a little bit of work for a speech I gave on the history of senior executive remuneration, actually in the US. Though the UK has, in a sense, evolved around it. And it was quite interesting looking at it over time, because what you find is that for a period really from the Great Depression through to the end of the 1970s, there is almost what is often described as a sort of almost a cultural norm, which in a sense says it is somehow morally a bit invidious for senior executive remuneration to get too far out of line with average earnings in a company. And this holds. The Great Depression is obviously a searing experience, and it would almost be sort of frowned upon in the society if you broke that norm. And then in the 1980s it changes, and if you go back to economics for a moment, that's the period in which agency theory starts to emerge on the scene. And agency theory really, in that context, you were saying earlier about principal agents, the principal agent issue comes back in. In that context, it's about how in a sense, you incentivize management to earn returns for shareholders. And that, put simply, that change goes up to the financial crisis. But it's quite interesting because in there, actually slightly before the 1980s, so 1974, I think it is, Milton Friedman wrote an article in the New York Times. And it's a very polemical article in many ways, because it's a Cold War article, but it's all about what are the duties of a corporation, and they are to, in its states, quite frankly, the duties of a corporation to maximise the returns to the owners. However, and Friedman is obviously, this article is often quoted as the sort of, in a sense, the sort of standard statement of agency theory in that sense. However, if you go back and read it, he actually says something slightly more than that in a slightly Smithian way. He says, it's to maximise returns to shareholders subject to the ethical standards of the day.
Yes.
Now, the interesting thing is that the second part of that statement is almost completely forgotten. You will find it very hard to any of the sort of the quotes that bring Friedman back into the story miss the second part out. The second part is quite Smithian, I would say. The challenge, I think, is what do you make of it? And I think the challenge, and I find this as a regulator, I'm looking back over the last 20, 30 years, I think the big challenge is those ethical standards in society do change over time. What drives them to change, other than having crises, is an interesting question. And as you rightly say in the book, how we bring that element of Smith back in, because there's no doubt that was, you can draw on Smith for this, and therefore what the role of, say, not only through regulators, but also through, in a sense, self-regulation.
Yes.
In that sense. How you bring back in this sort of ethical standards element is a very big question.
Yes, I totally agree. And how, and we should open up the thing to friends and colleagues across the room to speak, but how you demarcate a space of, as it were, things that are not done, although they're not contrary to law. I mean, that's the space of social norms, in a way, and that's the space that's come under so much pressure. And of course, the idea that society was being overtaken by commercial drivers or instincts is absolutely not unusual. I mean, it goes back to ancient times, and it's very powerful in the 18th century. But, and in part of Smith's genius is to see that it's the other side of an argument, and actually one can make an argument for commercial society, even if one's worried about these corrupting effects. But keeping those two sides in balance is absolutely of the essence. That's absolutely right. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, shall we open it up to you if you've got questions? Do we have a roving mic? Excellent, we have a roving mic. Splendid. Okay, we're going to go where you go, roving mic. Why don't we go here?
Hi. The two sides of the new right are the economically liberal side with Adam Smith and his idea that business knows best, and then the socially conservative side. Last week, the Foreign Secretary offered some advice to business that seemed to typify the clash between those two elements within the new right. where he sort of seemed to assert the sort of essentially the neo-nationalist, socially conservative side over the economically liberal business knows best side. Where do you think Smith would come down in that debate? What advice would he offer business?
When I was teaching and someone asked me an impossible question in a philosophy lecture, I'd always say, "Thank you so much for your intervention," and then move on immediately to the next question. Listen, it's a parlour game to say how would Smith react to X and Y, and of course part of the genius of Smith is that he makes an argument for the commercial effectiveness of markets at the same time as being extremely rude about the pathology of businesses that you sometimes see with what I've described as crony capitalism. Now, I don't actually think that's what was going on last week. I think what the Foreign Secretary was talking about was not about business. I don't know, no one knows, but I think he was talking about lobbying, and that's a different matter. And we do know that Smith would have had real concerns about what you might call excessive lobbying that might end up perverting the political system. I don't know whether, if we will come in, we'll tag team as we go. Keep going, we'll go here. I'm not going to name names when I know you because that's invidious. For the many I don't, exactly. Jeffrey, sorry.
My name is Jeff. My name is Jeffrey Owen at the Policy Exchange. I know this may be playing the parlour game, which we shouldn't be playing, but inevitably one thinks about what he, Adam Smith, might think about some of our current debates. Now, many people think, and not only on the left, that after around 1980, the capitalist system, especially in the UK and the US, got distorted into some people call neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, over-domination of finance, inequality, all that stuff. And this is sometimes contrasted with the system that existed.
Make sure everyone can hear you, Jeffrey, yeah.
Sorry?
Make sure everyone can hear you.
This is sometimes contrasted with the system that prevailed in the 50s and 60s, when finance was much less strong, unions were stronger, there wasn't the same degree of capital movements all over the world, and so on and so on. So there were this is what some people say, two different approaches to capitalism. Which one would he have preferred?
Right. Do you want to have a shot at that, Andrew, or shall I? Okay, I'll have one more shot on this, and then we'll. So my view on that is, first of all, the first thing Smith would do is actually look at the facts. Okay, and of course, one of the things one forgets about Wealth of Nations, if we're going to focus on Wealth of Nations, is that it's heaving with facts. Okay, Smith doesn't just give you one theory of markets, he gives you a whole bunch of different ideas of markets, and then he looks in detail at how the labour market works, how the herring market works, how the corn market works, and all these other things. It's very market-based, as you might expect and hope. Lots of evidence. And so if Smith were looking at the facts, I think he would distinguish between the shift in norms, which undoubtedly took place at some point between the 80s and the 90s, some point around there, in America and in Britain, and to a lesser extent in other countries as well, and the actual shift in economics. So the classic line that's often peddled, and you find it a lot on the left, is, well, of course, Mrs. Thatcher was responsible for the crisis of 2008 because, you know, it was that liberalisation that caused it. And of course, that is trite. We can be perfectly clear why the crisis of 2008 caused. It was because bank leverage, which had been 20 times for 40 years, between 1960 and 2000, went up to 50 times in 7 years. That's perfectly clear. So when you had, as the Banking Commission found, so when you touch the capital structure of a bank that's leveraged 50 times, it falls over. And I'm pleased to say we're now moving, thanks in large part to the fellow to my right, to a more prudential and, as it were, maxim-based view. And if you want to talk about that, Andrew, we're really interested to hear your views, because I may well be wrong, and I'd love to hear your views. But let me just say one other thing. The norm thing is different. And there you have to argue the question, was the shift in norms the proper rediscovery of the natural commercial instincts, what Smith calls the instinct to truck, barter, and exchange, or was it somehow, as it were, a rebarbative explosion of commercializing spirit? And my view is actually that Smith would have regarded it as, in large measure, a correction, which might have got out of hand from time to time, as it did with the collapse of the air bank in 1772.
I mean, just right. I think one of the fascinating questions that is embedded in this, and if you use the sort of financial crisis as the example, is how was it that this change, this change in, you use bank leverage as the sort of as the measure. How was it allowed to happen in a society that, it sort of recognised the risks involved? There were people who recognised the risks involved, but the prevailing sort of, in a sense, social norm was what I sometimes call the sort of the rising tide lifts all boats phenomenon. If banks are doing well, everybody will benefit. There was a good, you could hear that, and that was the light touch regulation. It wasn't invented by the FSA. There was a much broader, in a sense, acceptance that was the right thing to do. And I think how that came about is a salutary lesson for all of us. I can honestly say, in my roles I've had recently, I always said, the most important thing is to try to get established in this country and in other countries an institutional system of financial regulation that is robust to some of these changing norms, because history tells us, just as it did with monetary policy actually until until the 1990s, that we don't have a system that we can rely upon as being robust to some of these sort of shifting norms that will happen in society.
Yes, and we might need to alienate some day-to-day accountability in order to build more security against periodic crashes.
Yeah, and in a world, quite rightly, by the way, and I think this is consistent with Smith's view of the world, where appropriately agencies like my own are publicly and transparently accountable, because just to say, I joined the bank in 1985. That was in a sense, we were probably already into the shift by then, but there was still vestiges of the, behind the scenes, you got people in and told them, I wouldn't do that if I were you, and they sort of
Very much so.
went off. Whether they actually dutifully went off and did the right thing is another matter. There's a sort of parlour game that I sometimes play with people who I know have been around a long time, say, do you ever think there was a golden age of honesty? And I can tell you, very few of them say yes. There's a fantastic, I won't name the person, but a fantastic story one of them once told me, that in between finishing at school and going up to Oxford or Cambridge, he worked at a merchant bank, and this was back in the pre-Big Bang days. And in those days, if you were the broker to a company as a merchant bank, you got the results of the company several days before they were published. And there was a thing called a pink slip which you could fill in to trade the stock, knowing the results. And he was morally outraged by this, he said, as a young man. And he went home and told his father, who was a judge, assuming that his father would be morally outraged, his father bought the stock.
Well, there were no insider trading laws at the time.
There's no insider
Front running
trading.
front running was an established norm. Absolutely right.
So that's the one caveat to this, that we do always have to bear in mind this was there ever a golden age?
Okay, let's get some more questions. If we've got several questions, we can go more than one at a time. Come here, let's have a female voice.
I love discussions about norms, but norms require a community that knows what's going on.
Yeah.
And the dilemma today isn't really such a community. So 30 years ago, I knew that a lot of private doctors were absolutely ripping off the health service. They're in Harley-Strasse all the time. Nobody knew or cared, and it was all in London, because in London, they lived in Wimbledon and they worked in Harley Street, and people at home didn't know what they were doing. But other parts of the country were self-regulating, because if you lived in Guildford or you lived in Chelmsford or you lived in wherever else, people at home and at school knew your professional reputation. So exercising the effectiveness of norms means you can't really be anonymous. And one of the dilemmas, I think, is that people are now anonymous. And so perhaps one of the, I think, most shocking experiences I have in my life the last 18 years is the abuse of where and how people pay their tax. So I'm supposed to be an elite headhunter, and I'm literally sort of mouth open when people tell me about they live in Monaco and they live here and they live there and they've been brought up. I just think it is completely extraordinary. I do not think Adam Smith would have ever countenance that people behave in that way, or that corporations would behave in such an amoral way about where they pay their tax. And these are sort of deeply alienating behaviours. The second point about norms and being self-regulating, which is what I really believe in, is that I've always said, what a joy Britain, out of the FTSE 100, between 40 and 35% of the FTSE 100 chairs and chief executive are not Brits. But that also brings with it a slightly amoral attitude towards responsibilities to Britain, which I've only recently been reflecting on in the case of Brexit. So when I was in the cabinet, you knew that the captains of industry were actually sort of big Brits who wanted Britain to do well and had a sense of responsibility. It all sounds terribly pompous, but it is really, I am rather pompous and old-fashioned. So I want to know what Adam Smith would think about all of that, which is really my way of making a comment.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Virginia. Let me have a shot at that, and then if Andrew wants to come in, do. I think there is this fascinating thing, this tension, and you find the 18th century right it now, between what you might call virtue and wealth. And people who've acquired wealth want to be able to tell a story about their own virtue. Because, of course, in Smithian terms, everyone wants to be, not merely to be loved, but to be lovely. And so the story they tell is how, and of course, as you know, there are different stories. For people who are not wealthy, such as many politicians, it is, but for their priceless commitment to public service, they would be running FTSE 100 companies at any one time. For people who've made it in business, it is, in a dog-eat-dog world of meritocracy, merit must triumph, and thank goodness I've been able to make it to the top. And really, it's not about me, it's about the system that rewarding, secretly me. And I think that's part of the problem. The idea that there's no feedback mechanism between misbehavior and communal condemnation is unbelievable, is obviously absolutely crucially Smithian. And of course, it comes, one has to remember that Smith isn't merely a philosopher and a political economist, he's also a quietly, but pretty obviously, Scottish Presbyterian. He's got a very, very clear sense of what ethical behaviour looks like, and his theory of norms does, as it were, rely on there being enough feedback to reinforce a positive norm. And when you get, and the fascinating thing is then to look at how this theory, which can be used in the macro sense, but also in the micro, works in a technology-enabled world, where norms can get going at very low cost, as it were, using technology, and can sometimes take flight through anonymous support, although in fact everyone thinks they're completely disgusting. I don't think we have an answer to that question.
No, and I think you pose a fascinating question, because I think one of the things that lies at the heart of this, and I think, as somebody who's not a politician, I can sort of put this back to you, is going back to...
I'm speaking as a headhunter.
I got that. But, Smith set out in a sense, this question about sort of norms and morality. So the question about, in a sense, the role of the state for saying that is an acceptable practice or it isn't, and actually the role of broader society for saying that's an acceptable, because the state's only a function of society in that sense. For what is an acceptable practice in terms of paying tax, for what is an acceptable practice in terms of transparency about who owns the property around this building, because it's not easy to find out who owns the property around this building, because it's probably not owned in this country, actually. These are very deep questions, which I think there's an important question about what are the norms and how are they established within society?
But it also does point to a kind of transparency agenda. If you made clear what the ownership actually was of many things, then these feedback mechanisms could start to operate. And there's potentially an enormous area of public policy. You can, Virginia, but we've got other questions, so let's be very quick. Yeah.
Great goal of the law review, that you had to say how many board meetings the non-executive attend. But I thought, why not make all boards and also say where they pay their taxes? I mean, there'd be a whole of rage, but why shouldn't it be more transparent where people pay their taxes?
Indeed. I mean, yes. Sorry, we're going to go with another lady, and then we'll come to you, Sarah.
So I'm Cheryl Schoenhart-Bailey. I teach at the LSE. I know a lot more about the early 19th century British history than I do about Adam Smith. But let me ask you, if we were to bring a little bit fast forward Adam Smith, sort of thinking about classical economists, and lump him with David Ricardo, David McCulloch, or what I'm wondering is, does it even make sense, and I'll play devil's advocate here, does it even make sense to learn lessons from figures who were living in a society very much, and a lot of people are dancing around this, very much shaped by Christian values? And even up till recently, as Andrew describes, those values have shaped decisions in economics, in economic decision making. So if we think even about, which is very topical now, Brexit and repeal of the Corn Laws, Peel's decision was very much couched in Christian values. And to ignore those and to think about lessons from repeal or lessons from Adam Smith, are we actually distancing ourselves from the context which very fundamentally shaped both philosophers, politicians, voters, all of society? And I'll just add to this, if we think about the norms of behavior now, are we substituting, I'll just say this provocatively, are we substituting other norms like transparency and accountability? So we're using these as a substitute for, say, an agreed upon societal norm of Christian values. We're saying, okay, we'll make the behavior transparent, we'll make them accountable, but then what is the code by which we judge that behavior, that economic behavior?
Okay, so that's an incredibly interesting question. We've got a lot of other questions, so let me just be relatively quick, and we'll keep moving on if we can. So I don't read, although I think Smith is a Presbyterian and not, as it was sometimes thought, including by Boswell, who broke off relationships with him on this basis. He was not an atheist. He is a Presbyterian of a rather unusual kind. The way in which he sets up his system, the way in which he sets up the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations, does not appeal to any religious premise. Okay, it does not make an assumption about people being God-fearing Christians in order to be able to get the system going. It's not, in that sense, religiously mediated piece of work. It stands on an, as it were, a religiously neutral or value, in that sense, neutral thing. Its whole point is to show how out of human interactions you get values. You get values because we want to be, as it were, lovely in each other's eyes. That creates norms over time. Those norms then become compelling. They create value for other people. That's why, that's what the origins of morality and the way he sees it. Now, and of course, in a way, that's precisely what makes Smith not a classical economist. Because the classical economists are very much moving towards the idea of interest as being the only behavioral the only motivator, rather than all of these much wider spectrum of emotional interactions that Smith has. But I think there's a wider point which you raise rightly, which is, can society get going normatively without religion? To which the answer is, of course. I mean, it seems to me it can. I'm not sure Smith thinks ultimately it can, but there's certainly reasons to be optimistic. I mean, let me give you an example. Think about norms about the treatment of disabled people now versus 30 years ago. Okay? By definition, given the way in which morality is ceasing to be shaped by religion, it's hard to regard those as it were, the result of religion. They're a result of a series of evolved social decisions that we're not going to treat people in that situation in that way, and that we actually regard some of the behavior of 30, 40, 50 years ago as morally disgusting. Now, I think that's a rather achievement. I like that. I don't know whether others feel the same way, but so I think we can certainly move forward, as well as worrying about some of the specific normative failures that we find elsewhere in society.
I think if I just answer that, and I should, of course, declare an interest on merit to the question, so I should confess, but well, not confess, actually praise. I think Smith was trying to move on.
Rejoice.
Rejoice. Rejoice, the right verb. I think Smith was, in framing commercial society, I think Smith was trying to move on from a narrow, narrowly what you might call sort of medieval or feudal view of Christianity in economic society. It was very clear. I think, interestingly, I think if you look at Catholicism, I think it then had to sort of, about 100 years after Smith, it had to start to try to catch up with what had happened. But I, like you, I don't regard that as suggesting that Smith was in any sense atheist. But he was, I think, deliberately changing the framework of commercial society to, in a sense, allow the role of property rights, the role of the state to come in that sense.
There's a very deep rhetorical shift.
And that was very deliberate, I suspect.
Okay, so you've been very forbearing, thank you. And then I think we must go to the back of the room where poor folks have been languishing. Sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Paul Carroll, and I ask my question in the spirit of your book title, What Smith Thought and Why It Matters, in regard to the Navigation Acts. Now, my recollection of Smith's view of the Navigation Acts is that by excluding the Dutch, by shrinking the market, that it was against his ideas of open markets, broader markets, and greater prosperity. But even more important than that was national security. And so he supported the Navigation Acts in spite of the fact that it was economically less than ideal. Now, onto the why it matters part. Thinking of today, then, do you think then that things like the U.S. announcing punitive tariffs, for example, against would be more justified against maybe China, but far less justified against the European Union and Canada, because they are certainly less of a problem with national security. So, punitive tariffs for national security, yes or no?
Okay, right. So thank you for that. Thank you for that final invitation. You have a remarkably nuanced understanding of Smith's view. Thank you very much indeed for that. You're absolutely right. Smith despises the Navigation Acts for their effect on commerce, but he regards them as regrettable necessities for their effects on national security. And of course, they are just one of a very wide range of interventions he's prepared to contemplate, which include taxing spirits more than beer to reduce the consumption of alcohol, temporary monopolies, a duty in law to pay workers in cash rather than in kind, higher tax on rent than in kind. Money. There are lots of different interventions. And of course, special regulation of the banks and of currency. So that's absolutely right. Smith absolutely, of course, Smith believes that liberalising trade is absolutely going to increase people's well-being and prosperity. He also thinks, brilliantly, that there can be moments where you want to discipline someone from cheating. The game theorist in him doesn't want to allow the possibility that you might not want to, as it were, create a tariff or the equivalent in order to keep people honest. Now, you can then, I'm not going to do this, but people can then apply this analysis as they see fit, perhaps in the way you've described or in other ways, but that gives you the tools to do so. Okay, where's our microphonist? Forage heavily at the back there.
Hi, so I can buy your book.
What's your name?
Sorry, Rob Hutton from
Thank
Bloomberg.
you, Rob.
Unhelpful question. I can buy your book for, I think, £25 at the back of the room, or I can get it for £20 on Amazon.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could offer me any...
But he won't sign it on Amazon.
My signature's worth £5 a book, Rob. Load up. Come on, let's keep going. Any other questions?
Tom Dixon, Chief Executive of Freedom. So,
Freedom?
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
I'm impressed with
okay,
that.
it's a parlour game, but we're playing parlour games. What would Smith today think of the idea of the United Kingdom unilaterally removing all import duties, following the example of Singapore?
It's not a straightforward question, as I've described. I think he would see it in the context of the way a market had developed, as well as in the context of the economic benefits of the time. As I've said, he understands that markets and societies evolve in their economic basis. So his judgment is that it can make sense to impose tariffs under some contexts if what you're trying to do is to preserve or direct capital towards areas of your greatest productivity. So I don't think one should see Smith as a kind of natural laissez-fairist who automatically wants to lower import barriers, possibly in the hope of others will lower their import barriers. I think he's operating within a much more sophisticated conception of the way in which markets evolve and interact with each other.
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's quite hard, I think, to impute an answer to that from Smith. The debate that ensued in Britain in the 19th century on unilateral free trade, which is really, I think, a Cobdenite debate, not a Smithian debate in the sense of tracing it back. I think Smith predates that, so I find it quite hard to really give you an answer on what would Adam Smith have. If you take your question in the context of what I might call sort of the unilateral free trade position of the UK, particularly as it evolved in the sort of late 19th century and the sort of Cobdenite and post-Cobdenite period, I think it's pretty hard. I'd find it very hard to sort of impute an Adam Smith answer to that question.
We've got a couple of minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Are we finishing? Where's Dean? Are we finishing at 7:30? Is that my general? In that case, let's take a final quick round of questions from anyone who hasn't asked a question so far. So, couple up the front here. Anyone at the back? Okay, three quick fire questions at the front.
Malcolm Hurlston, do we know anything about Adam Smith as a consumer? If he'd had to catch the East Coast line down to London on one occasion, would he have cared whether it was nationalised or not? or would he have liked just an efficient service?
Very good question. Thank you.
Nelson Biddle. I lived in Japan in the 80s, and at the time, the head of a Japanese company could earn no more than 8 times the lowest paid worker. Now, this was ethical. It was smart. It was enlightened because they wanted to keep the unions out. But in addition to that, they understood the importance of having the entire organization pulling in one direction. How can we accomplish that today when so many are motivated by greed and if you will, separating themselves from so many others in society in their drive to collect as much cash as they possibly can? How can we do that among business leaders and also politicians?
Belcher of a second question. Finally.
You say, so how Darwinian was Smith, and how much did Darwin draw from Smith's ideas?
Okay. Adam Smith as consumer. Fascinating question. There's a marvellous moment when Smith is the commissioner of customs for all of Scotland towards the end of his life, and he writes in a letter. He says, "I got up today. I realised that almost every item of personal clothing I had breached our rules on imports and was therefore probably smuggled. I burnt." He means his cravats, all his cravats and neckwear. I burnt them immediately, because he realised he couldn't be a commissioner, and so he certainly does things. And of course, he makes this foundational move of saying, the purpose of production is to support consumption. That's an incredibly important kind of shift in the way in which economics thinks of itself and thinks of people that then become consumers. I don't think he has an idea of a consumer in the sense that we think of it, because he thinks of people as exchanging for use rather than merely consuming. But of course, it is consumer markets that work in the most Smithian way, so-called haircuts and hamburger markets. On the question about Japanese pay, of course, the fascinating question that raises is whether or not we might achieve greater economic benefit by a culture that was more norms mediated and less economic incentives mediated. That's the really interesting question that I take about it. And of course, the shift to long-term investment or incentive schemes, or LTIPs and the like, which was originally an attempt to align the interests of management with shareholders in the name of conquering the principal agent problem, has proved to be one of the biggest kind of free-for-alls in terms of the senior executives filling their boots around. Finally, how Darwinian was Smith? Well, of course, the story I tell about Smith is that
he thinks of markets as evolving entities, not merely in their own right, but in relation to government. And of course, that makes it impossible to say in any accurate way that people have a set of preferences at a particular moment, because their preferences are socially mediated. They're constantly evolving in relation to each other and in relation to, as it were, people outside. The norms that characterize human behavior are themselves evolving, and because norms shape human behavior, they affect markets. So what you have is an interactive whole that is developing in this in a way that does bear some analogies to evolution. Now you get negative evolution, you get bad norms emerging, but over time, and sometimes you get markets that are all about rip-offs and that don't, as it were, have the economic and equalizing benefits that Smith accepts. But overall, the system does appear to have those characteristics. And what's fascinating is you can give game theoretic analyses of social equilibria in just the same kind of way that you can give game theoretic analyses of economic equilibria, which suggests that there's a deeper underlying unity. And of course, we do know that Darwin read Smith pretty religiously in the 1820s, and so it doesn't seem impossible that he could have taken some of those ideas from Smith.
I just found on one point, which I think Jesse raises an absolutely critical point here about the distinction between norms and incentives. So as a regulator with objectives set by Parliament, I find it straightforward to operate on incentives which are compatible with my objectives. Norms are a very different thing. So if you play that out in the executive remuneration space, we are not regulators of pay levels. The Japanese point of incentive goes to that point exactly. What we have done, and this goes back to Jesse's point about Goldman Sachs, is to say we want to use regulation of remuneration for senior bankers to reset incentives. And we do that in two ways, really, which goes to two goals. One is to create what I call skin in the game by requiring firm remuneration on firm remuneration bonuses. The second one is, and it can be taken back if you're found to have the misdeeds come to light subsequently. We call that malice. Every time I've been in front of the Treasury Select Committee and get a transcript back, it's called malice in the transcript, and I try to point out that many people may think we've got a policy of malice, but we actually haven't. But it's very important. Jesse's point is very important. This distinction between incentives and norms is very important.
Let me just say one thing by nature of the description between incentives and norms, ladies and gentlemen, which is that when I used to sit on the Treasury Committee, Andrew Bailey would come into it, and on every occasion he had a strong incentive to do what every other person does who appears in front of the Treasury Committee, which is to shut up and stonewall. But I'm very pleased to say that Andrew's personal norms are about engaged, intelligent discussion and actually thinking about the problem and trying to help public policymakers think about the problems, and that's why it was always a pleasure to have him and occasionally to tempt him into indiscretion in the Treasury Committee, and I think you'll agree that we've seen some of those qualities on show tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a delight. Thank you so much. I can't finish without saying, please buy some books at the end, but thank you all for coming. It's been a delight.